Grace Moore, the Tennessee Nightingale, helped popularize opera to millions of Americans tuning in to the silver screen and radio. But she, like her fellow Southerners Margaret Mitchell and Elizabeth Dixon, suffered a mysterious end. Gone with the Wind author Margaret Mitchell died in a car crash. Elizabeth Dixon, whose brother was involved in the establishment of the KKK, also died in a car crash, and Grace Moore died in a plane crash in 1947. These deaths are strange, as they seem to have occurred when the South was poised to undergo a renaissance of culture in the 1940s. Let's learn more about Grace Moore. Moore was born Mary Willie Grace Moore in December 1898, the daughter of Tessa Jane née Stokely and Richard Lawson Moore. She was born in the rural community of Slabtown, now considered part of Del Rio, in Tennessee. Slabtown exists on the Tennessee River and is full of nature. By the time she was 2 years old, her family relocated to Knoxville, a move Moore later described as traumatic. She found urban life distasteful and foreign. Knoxville was growing in the year 1900, but also had its dangers. In 1901, Harvey Logan, member of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch gang, was arrested near Jefferson City in the shooting of two Knoxville police officers. The newspaper Sentinel had moved to a new building in the year 1900 to cater to greater readership. Knoxville Medical College, the city's first independent school for black physicians, was also established that year. The Knoxville Medical College graduated only 20 doctors during its 10-year period, and the school did not have a strict admissions requirement and only required a high school diploma. In 1906, the 8-year-old Grace lost one of her younger brothers, an event that caused a crisis within her family. She became difficult, playing truant, stealing, fighting, using foul language at home and school, evidence of the strong and sometimes confrontational personality she would display in adult life. Her rigidly Baptist father, who was from North Carolina, was opposed to frivolous behavior of any kind, and a few years after her rebellion, she was made to apologize in front of her entire church congregation for breaking rules on dancing. Any prejudice wasn't apparent in the Moore family. Richard Lawson Moore was keen to prosper in business, and he made close ties with everyone in the community. His efforts in building these bonds led to him being named an honorary Tennessee colonel. After several years in Knoxville, the family again relocated to Jellicoe, Tennessee, where Moore spent her adolescence. Moore's father worked in lumber, and so the family moved to follow the market. After high school in Jellicoe, she studied briefly at Ward Belmont College in Nashville. Ward Belmont College was a women's college located in Nashville, Tennessee. It came from the merger of the Ward Seminary for Young Ladies and the Belmont College for Young Women in 1913. The college was located on the grounds of the Belmont Mansion, the antebellum estate of Adelicia Hayes Franklin Ackland Cheatham. It was the first junior college in the South to receive full accreditation by the Southern Association of Colleges and Secondary Schools. It was sold in 1951. The entrance to the college and its Conservatory of Music was for students who had completed high school, which Moore had done. The College and Conservatory of Music were 2-year junior college programs that prepared students for senior universities. To accommodate the large number of students, 3 dormitory buildings were built, which Moore may have stayed in: Pembroke, Heron, and Hale. These dormitories are still in use at Belmont University. According to Tamino Autographs, in their very detailed blog post about Moore, in 1916 she left home for the exclusive Ward Belmont College in Nashville, the boarding school that should have done much to further her education. She impressed the dean of the vocal department greatly, but she didn't study hard. She was undisciplined, disruptive, and foul-mouthed. She broke school rules to attend a dance at Vanderbilt University and was sent back to Jellicoe as a result. The college couldn't put up with her behavior, and she was expelled in 1917, although 24 years later she was warmly welcomed back, even establishing a scholarship there to support needy students. Moore then moved to Washington, D.C. She had decided to take her education and musical training into her own hands. She applied to the Wilson Green School of Music in Washington, D.C., one of a network, which seems to now be a public high school, taking care of all necessary arrangements herself. Her father had little choice but to give his blessing and give in to his strong-willed daughter. She experienced a high level of vocal training at the school and also earned her first professional income singing in a local Baptist church, which impressed her father. The other major turning point in Moore's life in her first year in D.C. was meeting Mary Garden. This Scottish soprano, famous as a role creator and muse of Massenet, was in the capital to give performances to benefit wounded Allied soldiers during World War I. Moore resolved, as a consequence, to become an opera star, just like Garden. Her operatic debut came singing a single aria from Aida at the Washington National Theater in February 1919. This annual concert of the Wilson Green School, Moore left just a few months later, traveling to New York City, intending to start her stage career. Her father pursued her, keen for her to change her mind. However, her promise only to appear in ladylike performances persuaded him to allow her to carry on. She kept this promise. Even today, when she appears in print, it is as Ms. Moore. New York City was where she would continue her musical training and really begin her career in earnest. The Black Cat Cafe in Greenwich Village was where she landed her first professional singing gig. She performed in nightclubs to help pay for singing classes. She really wanted to sing. It didn't care where she went. She didn't care where she went as long as she could be singing, toning her fine soprano voice. She gained the nightclub singing job through appearing in a singing contest in Greenwich Village. It was modestly paid at first until her success led to a permanent engagement and a substantial pay raise. But that success was performing with very little rest in a poorly ventilated, smoky nightclub, and it led to damage to her vocal cords. The advice of the doctor, who took care of the stars of the Metropolitan Opera, P. Mario Marafiati, was that she behave in complete silence for 3 months. She took this very seriously and went to Canada in a home along the St. Lawrence River of a friend, hoping that she would be able to sing again. By the end of 1919, she was singing again, touring in an operetta, The Chocolate Soldier, and performing in a musical that sadly failed according to pre-Broadway previews. Her big break on Broadway came in 1920, in the Jerome Kern musical named for a type of dance, the Hitchy Coo, filling in for an indisposed colleague. She lived the Broadway star lifestyle for a while, mixing with the set who made up the round table at the Algonquin Hotel. During this period, she almost married sculptor George Biddle, a man almost 10 years her senior. However, a combination of ambition and unwillingness to settle down meant that the attachment failed to become permanent. Biddle was a U.S. Army veteran who was educated at private schools like Groton in Connecticut. Moore would later settle in Connecticut. He threw himself into the Federal Art Project after his romance with Moore, which used taxpayer dollars to bring art to schools and public buildings in the form of murals. Moore spent 1922 in Paris, attempting to kickstart her opera career, perhaps on advice from Biddle, who had spent time there as well. Her charm and glamour made her a hit with the social and artistic set, and she became friends with both Noel Coward and Cole Porter, and you can learn more about Porter's muse, Evelyn Hoey, in her video on this channel. Moore also renewed her acquaintance with opera singer Mary Garden, who gave the young singer a lot of encouragement. But Paris was expensive for Moore, and an invitation in 1923 from Irving Berlin to come back to New York City and appear in his Music Box Review was gratefully accepted. In 1922 and 1923, she appeared in the second and third of Irving Berlin's series of 4 Music Box Reviews. In the 1923 edition, she and John Steele introduced Berlin's song What'll I Do, which became her trademark. When Moore sang in Orange Grove in California, orange blossom perfume was wafted through the theater for a full experience. The reviews spoke of the warmth and vitality in her voice, and she was a huge hit. Unfortunately, her colleagues were competitive and less than happy with her lengthy curtain calls, leading to complaints she hogged the limelight. Despite being a rising star on Broadway, she was still intent on opera as a career and returned to Europe in 1925 for further classical study, increasing her abilities in Spanish and French. 3 years of hard work with a succession of European teachers prepared her musically and linguistically for an opera career. She made her debut as Mimi in La Bohème at the Metropolitan Opera in February 1928. She was nervous, and her performance was not perfect, but a lot of critics were kind to her, and the quality and warmth of her voice were praised. She was to sing Italian and French operas at the New York Metropolitan Opera for 16 seasons, with roles including Tosca, Manon, and her favorite Louise, which was also considered to have been her greatest role. A stint on NBC Radio's General Motors Hour brought her to wider fame throughout America, prior to her trying her luck in Hollywood. Her first screen test made her appear overweight and dumpy, and her contract with MGM was contingent upon her losing 15 pounds and maintaining the new weight. She did this with a good diet of clear soup. Her first film was A Lady's Morals in 1930, a biopic on the life of the 19th century operatic soprano Jenny Lind. Her singing suffered from poor recording techniques, and it was a box office flop. Her second film, in 1930 as well, New Moon, based on the Sigmund Romberg musical of the same name, fared no better, but it seems to have experienced a bit of a renaissance in YouTube clips today. MGM terminated her contract after New Moon, and it seemed her film career was at an end. Her only consolation was that other opera stars were having an equal lack of success in crossing over to the big screen. She took a break after New Moon, sailing to France in May 1931. She met her husband, Valentin Val Pereira, a Spanish actor and singer, on the ship, and married him just 2 months later in July. The deputy mayor of Cannes officiated over what was a quiet civil wedding, but the guests included Hollywood royalty such as Charlie Chaplin and Gloria Swanson. Her Southern Baptist family were less than impressed with her choice of a Spanish Catholic as a husband. However, Pereira was an adept business manager, adjusting his own career to look after his wife's. Depression-era America meant that relying on a career at the Metropolitan Opera alone was not going to be practical due to spiraling inflation and many other concerns, and so Moore diversified into light opera, vaudeville, and radio. In 1932, she appeared on Broadway in the short-lived operetta The Du Barry by Carl Milliker. A further film break came in 1934, One Night of Love, under the contract of Columbia Pictures, which showcased her in a variety of extracts from Grand Opera, and in addition to an Academy Award nomination for Moore, it made her a box office star. She noted, "It brought a new public into the opera houses and made all opera stars movie-minded." One Night of Love was famous and successful. For contributing to raising the standard of cinema entertainment, Moore was awarded a medal by the Society of Arts and Science. 1935 saw her regular NBC half-hour weekly show, a format including musical numbers and conversation with her audience regarding her life and work. She was now a star, earning a substantial salary from her radio appearances alone, and was able to set her own fee for concerts. She bought a house in Beverly Hills, had servants, and even met the Prince of Wales after her London debut at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. More films followed, including the cinematic version of Gustave Carpentier's Louise. Coached by Carpentier himself, who participated by making cuts and changes, the film also stars Georges Thill and André Pernay. However, the threat of the outbreak of the Second World War raised the real possibility that the project might be abandoned completely as it was being filmed in France. Hitler was threatening to invade Czechoslovakia, and despite a warning from the U.S. ambassador for all American citizens to return home with immediate effect, Moore ignored him and chose to stay in France. She and her husband were forced to leave in August 1939. The ship she and her husband left on was very overcrowded, and they could not sleep. 2 days after they set sail, Hitler invaded Poland. The war years were personally difficult for Grace Moore. Her husband developed tuberculosis and was forced into a specialist hospital for a long stay. During the spring of 1940, Moore started a long tour of the USA and Canada, immediately followed by a sponsored goodwill visit to Mexico. In the 1930s and 1940s, she gave concert performances throughout Europe, performing a repertoire of operatic selections and other songs in German, French, Italian, Spanish, and English. Even today, you can find posters of her in German or Spanish. During World War II, she was active in the USO, entertaining American troops abroad. In 1945, she sang her La Boheme part for the inaugural performance of the San Antonio Grand Opera Festival. But her entire USO tour seemed blighted. The Canadian part included being stranded on a train during a severe blizzard, and her Mexican visit coincided with the country's worst earthquake in 25 years, leading American newspapers to report that she was dead. She also performed during and after World War II in support of the Allied forces. From the personal memoir of Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee in July 1945, after an early dinner drove in convoy to the Paris Opera House for the gala performance entitled Pacific 45, given by the French for the benefit of the families of French war veterans. The program laid particular emphasis on the war in Japan and included the showing of 2 films, Fighting Lady and Iwo Jima, and the rendition of several songs, and the French and American national anthems by Grace Moore. Seated in the box of honor were General Alphonse Juin, the French Minister of Information, and a number of important American and French officers. It seemed to be a great success, and was particularly appreciated by the crowd of some 20,000 gathered in the square outside the Opera House. A memorable highlight of When You're in Love of 1937 was a comic scene in which Moore donned a flannel shirt and trousers and joined a 5-man band for a flamboyant rendition of Minnie the Moocher, complete with gestures but with the lyrics slightly altered to conform with Hollywood sensibilities. She also performed the popular Madame Butterfly duet in the film I'll Take Romance. She also starred across from Cary Grant. She was widely criticized in December 1938 when she curtsied to the Duchess of Windsor in Cannes. Upon her return to the United States after 6 months and 10 days in Europe to save money in income tax, she said, she defended her curtsy, saying she would have been a royal duchess long ago if she had not been an American. After all, she gave happiness and the courage of his convictions to one man, which is more than most women can do. She deserves a curtsy for that alone. According to vaudeville performer and historian Joe Laurie Jr., Moore would not perform on vaudeville bills that included black performance. This is very difficult to believe as her stint in vaudeville was very short and she performed in Greenwich Village, which entertained mixed audiences for years. If it was true, Moore might have experienced extreme violence or heard about it from her family's antebellum days. Knoxville was not the safest place for a young white woman to grow up, and Moore had a natural distaste for urban environments. In 1935, she received the Gold Medal Award of the Society of Arts and Sciences for conspicuous achievement in raising the standard of cinema entertainment. In 1936, King Christian X of Denmark awarded her his country's medal of Ignito et Arti. In 1937, she was commissioned an honorary colonel on the staff of the governor of Tennessee, following in her father's footsteps, and was also made a life member of the Tennessee State Society of Washington, D.C. She was decorated as a Chevalier of the French Legion d'Honneur in 1939. She was a member of the Peabody Awards Board of Jurors from 1940 to 1942. She published an autobiography in 1944 titled You're Only Human Once. In 1953, a film about her life was released titled So This Is Love, starring Kathryn Grayson. Her willful and sometimes difficult nature, considered difficult even by the standards of opera stars, she had displayed as a child came to the fore once again. On a second goodwill tour of South America, she refused to appear at a party given in her honor. In addition, her personal life started to draw criticism in the 1940s. Her husband was an invalid by that time and had stopped starring in Spanish language movies by the mid 1930s. Moore found herself alone on long tours and started to have affairs. Immediately, gossip about her life started from jealous and other women stars. Her friend and colleague Rosa Poncel had said about her in the previous decade, she became an earthy woman who sampled love on every table, and rumor has it that the tables were numerous. Moore intended to write a cookery book, a collection inspired by her many years as both a keen amateur cook and from her visits to a variety of restaurants on her travels. However, the cookery book turned into an autobiography, and You're Only Human Once was published in March 1944 and became a bestseller. By 1945, her looks were failing, and some noticed that her cognitive abilities weren't as strong as they once were. She forgot lines and became disoriented on stage, and even began to sing in the wrong key. She was no longer the slim, glamorous opera star, and so she turned her attentions to other interests, including teaching and hosting various young opera stars at her home in Connecticut. Her vocal technique, always the subject of much discussion and criticism, was sorely criticized, and some believe she started to collapse completely. If Moore was able to turn her star power into a vehicle for freedom of association, establishing schools for white women only, for example, she would have been seen as a huge threat to the globalist establishment that took place after World War II. She was a member of very prominent boards, had expanded into teaching, and held high positions on the Tennessee Governor's Board and on arts councils in Washington, D.C. Her multinational draw wasn't insubstantial. She was proud to be Southern, proud to be from Tennessee, and remarked to interviewers that she was at heart a Tennessee hillbilly. This regional pride was and is a real threat to the sweeping, broad categories of globalism. Her 1946 Mimi in the Louis-Own Stadium in New York was bad enough to bring not only critical reviews, but a cool audience response as well. But she was back at the top of her powers for one final tour in 1947, culminating in a final concert where all of her former radiance from her peak returned. The Scandinavian tour she had embarked upon had been arranged by two impresarios who joined her on the plane taking off from Kastrup Airport in January 1947. Did she know Swedish Prince Gustav Adolf well, who was also on the plane, and was there a deeper reason why they were both on this flight? Prince Gustav Adolf was hated by the Swedish Social Democrat Party, and the Social Democrats would flood Sweden with illegal rapists, false asylum claimees, and child abusers for decades after his death. Did Prince Gustav Adolf see this coming? He was rumored to be friends with Hitler, which has been disputed, but he also had a very strong loyalty to the Scandinavian states. More had been honored personally by the King of Denmark, and you can learn more about the Danish royal jewels on this channel. Was she and he trying to help bring together some Scandinavian alliance, at least artistically? Prince Gustav Adolf was super involved in Olympics trials in his country, and so expanding that to artist performances and groups might not have been too far-fetched. Moore boarded the DC-3 airliner to leave for Sweden from Copenhagen. The aircraft stalled after takeoff, and observers on the ground noted that it rolled twice before falling to the ground, where it exploded on impact. The resultant fireball was so intense, rescue crews could not get near the wreckage for over an hour. Identified by an inscription on a gold bracelet given to her by her husband, Grace from Val, which still apparently smelled of perfume, the Tennessee Nightingale died alongside her accompanist, Jean-Luc Peltier, and the impresario Roland Fernand Melbeck. Gerda Newman, the Danish actress, died alongside her impresario husband, Jens Denau, Denau's 3-year-old nephew, and Hans Denning Thompson, who had helped Denau arrange Moore's tour. According to John Shearer for the Chattanoogan, her clothes, shoes, medals, and other items from public appearances are now at the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville, after years of being at the McClung Museum of Natural History and Culture on the University of Tennessee, or UT, campus in Knoxville. But Tennessee didn't seem to know what to do with Grace Moore's stuff for years. Monuments are built to BLM, and vandalism of Confederate monuments is enabled, no problem, but Grace Moore's items were mostly kept in storage, except for a few occasions, including when some of the items were on display, when her movie One Night of Love was shown at the Tivoli Theater in the 1970s. At that time, the items were moved around and then finally moved to Nashville in 2008. Jefferson Chapman, the director of the McClung Museum, said the decision to transfer the collection to Nashville was due to 2 reasons, including that the McClung facility doesn't have a conservator or curator of textile-related items. We felt that for the good of the collection, the State Museum would be the best repository, he said. Second, we have been assessing our collections in light of our mission as a university museum, and felt that the State Museum was a more appropriate venue for the important Tennessee person, that is, Grace Moore. Candace Adelson, senior curator of fashion and textiles for the Tennessee State Museum, said that none of the transferred items have yet been displayed at the Dederick Street facility in Nashville, but that plans were to do so in 2016. Some of them will definitely be among the exhibits planned for the Tennessee State Museum's new facility on Nashville's Bicentennial Mall, which is slated to open in fall 2018, she said. Moore's parents had moved to Chattanooga permanently during her adult years and lived at 2 homes at 1661 and 1637 Hillcrest Road in Riverview, just above the Chattanooga Golf and Country Club. 1661 Hillcrest Road was built in 1905 and sold for $4.4 million in 2023, an indication of how the South continues to be mined by carpetbaggers. Moore occasionally visited Chattanooga. Sometimes it was to sing, and other times it was just to visit family, but the visits apparently always included her dispensing a little of her charm. In 1939, she was visiting her ill mother. She was with her pianist at the time due to being on tour, and amicably credibly told a Chattanooga Times reporter she shared a cab with that she also planned to enjoy a meal at the Lookout Mountain home of her sister, Mrs. Thomas Mahan, during her visit. Despite her storybook life, which she mined for her movie appearances, it had a tragic end in January 1947 following the plane crash in Copenhagen, Denmark. She was buried at Forest Hills Cemetery following a service at the now raised First Baptist Church on Georgia Avenue in Chattanooga. After her death, her items were originally given to the Museum of the City of New York, but in 1949 they were transferred to the University of Tennessee by her brother, James Moore Sr. They were originally stored at Hoskins Library at UT until the McClung Museum opened in the 1960s. Some of the paper-based and discography items are still in the Special Collections Department based in UT's Hodges Library. Dr. Adelson added she believes the Metropolitan Opera in New York still has a few of Miss Moore's items, including photographs, and the New York Public Library also has some of her home movies. Moore broke audience records during her career, and so everyone wanted a piece of her, so to speak. For a number of years, beginning in 1937, her main home and refuge where some of her home movies might have been shot was far Away Meadows. It was a historic salt box style farmhouse in the Newtown Sandy Hook area of Connecticut, which she more than doubled in size. Included in the expansion were a guest house, modern kitchen, game room, an artesian well-fed swimming pool, and, of course, a music room. You can learn more about Truman Capote's salt box style home on this channel. In 1937, Moore and her husband had bought the early 18th century house on 7 Bradley Lane, building first a guest house, which was moved across Nutmeg Lane during a later owner's divorce dispute on their 348 acres, in which to live during renovations in the pre-Revolutionary War house. The couple had a kitchen, great room, and game room added, and named the property Faraway Meadows, evoking the expansive vistas of those days. Grace Moore loved Faraway Meadows. She even devoted an entire chapter to it in her autobiography, said Miss Hayes, who would come to own Faraway Meadows. The elegant home and beautiful property of the mid-20th century was a long-forgotten thing when she and her late husband, Tim Hayes, came upon the listing in 1993. We were living in Ansonia at the time and looking for a house. The market was crazy then. But I picked up one of those color photo real estate booklets and saw this house advertised for just $269,000, said Miss Hayes. By then the house had been on the market for more than 3 years, and the real estate agents were not interested in speaking with anyone other than another broker. Fortunately, as a property manager, Mr. Hayes had many real estate connections, including his partner, a broker who got the deals on the property for them, the real-life showing of New York City elitism in action. Most likely predating 1730, based on the use of wooden lintels in the large fireplaces in the original section of the house, it was probably built by one of the early Newtown, Connecticut settlers, the Bradleys. A September 1939 photograph in the Hartford Times shows Moore poring over accounting books from a time when the part of the house was used as a general store. What we found out was that Grace Moore was a very savvy person. In everything I've read about her, it seems she was a woman who knew what she wanted and how to get it, said Hayes. A paved Bradley Lane was one of the desires that Moore engineered. Bradley Lane was just a stone road when Grace and her husband moved here. Then the governor of Connecticut asked her to sing at his inauguration. Well, Grace Moore didn't sing for free. She said she would be happy to do so for 2 things. She wanted Bradley Lane paved, and she wanted a bidet in her house, Miss Hayes said. Miss Moore sang, the road was paved, and the bidet, not generally available at the time, was installed. In her 1944 autobiography, You're Only Human Once, Moore wrote that she loved the Connecticut home most. I have owned many houses, but this is our real home, she wrote. According to a historical publication passed along by the C. H. Booth Library in Newtown, Moore conducted a Grace Moore School of Singing at the home in the summers of 1940 and 41, and she held a meeting and tea for the Newtown Orchestral Society in 1940. Moore and her Spanish-born husband, Valentine, who lived until 1986, took immaculate care of the home and expansive acreage during her life. However, it later became run down during subsequent decades under other owners. According to an article on the home, it was later owned by screenplay writers Ruth Gordon and Garson Kanin, and part of the 1949 Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy film Adam's Rib, written by the couple, was filmed at Faraway Meadows. Ruth Gordon could not have been more different from Grace Moore. Gordon had a nasally voice and won an Academy Award for her role as a satanic woman in Rosemary's Baby. She sold the historic American home to developers who wanted to carve it up. Faraway Meadows later had a couple of other owners, but after it was sold in 1972, it began to fall into disrepair. One owner was an entertainment lawyer from New York City who attempted to use it as a weekend house, but that became difficult because the house is sort of a full-time job. Nature played havoc on the historic residence when a giant maple fell on it in the late 1980s. The home later went into foreclosure. Ellen Hayes said she and her late husband bought the home at 7 Bradley Lane in 1993 and it was in bad shape. The bank owned it for 3.5 years, and it had been neglected many more years than that, she said. During Grace's tenure, it was more than a 340-acre gentleman's farm, but was pared down to just the main house on 2 acres, although eventually we acquired an adjoining 2-acre parcel. Hayes said her husband was the one who fell in love with it initially, and they had no idea all the work that needed to be done, but it became an all-consuming project. We did as much as we could ourselves, but also hired professionals for the larger projects, such as replacing the sills, the furnace, the cedar roof. Interestingly, Hayes would make decisions such as replacing white paint with an avocado green paint, and find that she had made the exact choice Moore did decades earlier. They were proud of the work and said the home, which is about 7 miles away from where the tragic Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting took place in 2012, looked as good as it did after Grace Moore finished the work. Miss Hayes jokingly added that they actually did not know who Grace Moore was until a local resident mentioned the connection to them. That began their education of Miss Moore. The local paper later did a newspaper article on them, the restoration, and the home's connection to the Star, and a number of people began contacting them. We met former owners, their children, a man whose grandfather worked on the house for Grace, fans from near and far, and even Grace's former secretary, she said. But the most interesting person they met, she said, was former Chattanoogan Marion Powers, who was the widow of Grace's brother, Jim Moore Sr., and the mother of Charlie Moore, the late Jim Moore Jr., and the late 1958 Girls Preparatory School May Queen, Grace Moore named for her aunt. Marion was such an interesting woman, she said. She was so pleased with our restoration of the house, and she cried upon seeing it after all those years. She eventually gifted us Grace's grand piano, a 1928 Bechstein. Other items owned by Grace Moore also found their way back to Faraway Meadows from many sources. Miss Hayes added that they welcomed every visitor and every query regarding Grace Moore, and they became like caretakers of her home and her legend. Faraway Meadows was sold by the Hayes in 2012, but she still holds on to the precious memories of this very accomplished entertainer of yesteryear. She was so incredibly famous during her lifetime. It's a shame more people don't know her name today, she said. It is wonderful to live and sing. It is a great thing to feel that one is able to help other people with one's voice. I want to play in a new opera where the heroine does not die in the last scene or go mad. That is why I love Carpentier's Louise. The girl is alive when the curtain falls, and it is wonderful to be alive, isn't it? Grace Moore said these words a few days before she died. On the evening of Saturday, January 25th, 1947, American soprano Grace Moore sang to a sellout audience of over 4,000 people in Copenhagen, culminating in a standing ovation. The next day, she boarded a plane to Stockholm. It cleared for takeoff and climbed to an altitude of around 150 feet, where it stalled and crashed to the ground, exploding on impact. A review found a young technician had forgotten to remove the elevator bolt pins before takeoff. All 22 crew and passengers on board the aircraft, including Prince Gustav Adolf of Sweden, were killed instantly. And now for the dulcet tones of Grace Moore in her favorite opera, Louise.